four components of our core values. Scripture, first of all, we believe that God broke in history and spoke decisively, and that decisive, definitive statement comes in the Scriptures, and as such, then we ought to adhere to them, seek to know them, live into them. And we believe at seminary that, as Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. And so that's where we start. The second notion, this notion of community, then that our community ought to then be constructed, and we ought to maintain that community around the ethos of Scripture, so that Scripture really animates everything we do. We don't want to just believe Scripture and say, this is our credo, but we want to embody it and bear witness to it. For instance, the Epistle of James says, be slow to speak, quick to listen, slow to become angry. What does it mean to not just believe that as an ideal, but to really live that out in our relationships with one another? So I think as a seminary, we ask ourselves whether the Scripture is making a specific claim, whether we have a story of Jesus, whether a hymn, a poem, a prayer that we find in Scripture. We say, how do we live into this? How do we express this? How do we embody it, bear witness to it? And together, that makes a community that has formative properties. So that's what we seek to do in part. Academic excellence, one of our core values as well. At some educational institutions, there's this strong divorce between life of the mind and life of the soul. What we're saying is that divorce should not be there at all, but that academic expression, that is the life of the mind, proceeds from the life of the soul, and that to study, to write a paper, to give a speech, to construct a sermon is worship to God. And so academic excellence really is not an entity of its own, but is our gift back to God, and we show our love to God by our academic work. So that's an important component. There's a hymn by Charles Wesley, Methodist hymn writer from the 18th century, who at the opening of a school wrote a specific hymn for that school. And one of the lines from that hymn says this: unite the pair so long disjoined, knowledge and vital piety. And that's what we're trying to do, to unite knowledge and vital piety. And then that takes us to this last core value, the notion of spiritual formation. The word disciple in Scripture simply means, in its most basic root meaning, means learner. And so we are saying that when you take Scripture as the core and construct a community around that core idea, seek to embody it, and then have a community of scholars who are seeking to worship God through the life of the mind, that this will be formative, and it will cause people to be shaped to be more like Christ and to look more like the Scriptures, to mature them so that they can be effective in their ministries going forward.